Sometimes the most ordinary moment can change everything. Daniel Vega never expected that rushing to help a stranger would cost him his job, his security, and nearly his hope. He was just a maintenance worker trying to get through another shift. At the downtown hotel, keeping his head down and his paycheck steady for his daughter's sake. But when chaos erupted on the street below and he saw someone in danger, instinct took over. He didn't know the woman he pulled to safety was Miranda Ellison, one of the city's most private philanthropists. He didn't know she'd been walking those streets to understand the very problems her family's wealth had helped create. All he knew was someone needed help. What happened next would test everything both of them believed about sacrifice, second chances, and what it really means to save someone. But could two people from completely different worlds truly find their way to each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn silence at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every weekday for the past 3 years. Daniel Vega's calloused hand found the snooze button with practiced precision, his body already conditioned to wake moments before the mechanical intrusion. In the thin mattress beside him, 8-year-old Emma stirred but didn't wake, her small face peaceful in the dim light filtering through their apartment's single window. Daniel sat up slowly, his back protesting the movement. The sofa bed had seen better days, much like everything else in their cramped one-bedroom apartment on the city's east side. He'd given Emma the bedroom, of course. A growing girl needed her own space, her own walls to decorate with the drawings she created with such fierce concentration each evening at their second-hand kitchen table. The morning ritual began in silence. Coffee from the machine he'd bought at a pawn shop 2 years ago, strong and black because milk was a luxury saved for Emma's cereal. Shower with water that ran lukewarm on good days, ice cold when the building's ancient boiler struggled. Work. Clothes pressed the night before, hanging on the bathroom door because they had no closet space to spare. Daniel caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror and paused. At 34, he looked older, lines etched around dark eyes that had once held easy laughter, grey threading through black hair that Emma said made him look distinguished like the dads on TV. The comparison always made him smile, even as it reminded him of everything he couldn't give her. "Daddy," Emma's sleepy voice drifted from the bedroom. "Just getting ready for work, Mija. Go back to sleep." "Can't. Mrs. Patterson next door is playing her TV loud again." Daniel sighed. Mrs. Patterson, 73 and mostly deaf, had been their neighbor since they'd moved to this building. Her late-night television habits were legendary throughout the complex, but Daniel had never complained. She also watched Emma after school when his shift ran long, refusing payment beyond occasional help with her groceries. "Come here, sweetheart." Emma padded out in her favorite pajamas, the ones with cartoon cats that were getting too small, but still made her smile. Her dark hair, so like her mother's, stuck up at impossible angles. "Bad dreams?" he asked, smoothing her hair with gentle fingers. "No, just thinking about my science project. Mrs. Chen says we need to present next Friday, and I still don't know if my volcano will work right." Daniel knelt to her level, his hands on her small shoulders. At 8, Emma carried worries that seemed too heavy for someone so young. She'd learned early that money was tight, that Daddy worked hard for everything they had, that some dreams had to wait. "Tell you what, this weekend, we'll test that volcano until it's perfect. Deal?" Her smile lit up the dim apartment. "Deal. But Daddy, baking soda costs money." "Don't you worry about that. Your education is the most important thing in the world to me." It was true, though Daniel had no idea where the money for school supplies would come from. His paycheck from the Grand Metropolitan Hotel covered rent, utilities, and basic groceries, with exactly $17 left over each month. That $17 had to stretch for everything else. Emma's growing feet that constantly needed new shoes, school supplies, the small emergencies that seemed to arrive with clockwork regularity. Emma hugged him tight, her arms barely reaching, around his broad shoulders. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too, Misha, more than all the stars." It was their ritual, the promise he'd whispered to her every night since her mother died. Cancer had taken Maria quickly, leaving Daniel to navigate. Single parenthood with a 5-year-old who asked heartbreaking questions he couldn't answer. 20 minutes later, Daniel was on the city bus heading downtown, his worn work bag containing his lunch, 2 peanut butter sandwiches and an apple, and the small notebook where he tracked every expense. The bus ride gave him 30 minutes to read, usually library books about business or construction management. Dreams of something better, something that might give Emma the life she deserved. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel rose 23 stories into the morning sky, its glass facade reflecting the city, awakening around it. Daniel had worked there for 2 years, part of the maintenance crew responsible for keeping the building's complex systems running smoothly. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and it came with health insurance that covered Emma's medical needs. "Morning, Vega." Frank Martinez, the maintenance supervisor, barely looked up from his clipboard as Daniel signed in. Frank was old school, a company man who'd worked his way up from janitor to supervisor over 15 years. He ran a tight operation and expected his crew to follow protocol without question. "Morning, Frank. What's the priority today?" "7th floor's having HVAC issues again. Mrs. Pemberton in the penthouse is complaining about noise from the units. You know how these rich folks are. They hear one odd sound and think the world's ending." Daniel nodded, familiar with the peculiar demands of the hotel's wealthy long-term residents. The Grand Metropolitan wasn't just a hotel. The upper floors housed exclusive apartments for the city's elite. People who paid more in monthly rent than Daniel earned in a year. The service elevator carried him to the 7th floor, where he began his methodical inspection of the heating and cooling systems. It was work that required patience and attention to detail, qualities Daniel had developed over years of necessity. Every job had to be done right the first time. There were no second chances when you were one paycheck away from disaster. As he worked, Daniel's mind wandered to Emma's upcoming science fair. She'd been working on her volcano project for weeks, determined to create something spectacular. Last night, she'd shown him her carefully drawn diagrams and written explanation of chemical reactions. Her handwriting was getting so much better, her understanding of scientific concepts impressive for her age. "She's smart, Daniel," Maria used to say during those last difficult months. "Smarter than both of us. Promise me you'll make sure she gets to use that brain." It was a promise that drove every decision Daniel made. Every early morning, every extra shift, every night spent helping with homework instead of watching television. Emma would have opportunities he'd never had. Somehow, some way, he'd make sure of it. Across town, in a world Daniel couldn't imagine, Miranda Ellison sat in her private office on the 40th floor of the Ellison building, staring out at the city she'd inherited but never truly understood. At 31, she was the reluctant heir to a real estate empire built by her grandfather and expanded ruthlessly by her father. The Ellison name was synonymous with luxury development, high-end properties that transformed neighborhoods and, critics argued, displaced the people who'd called those neighborhoods home. Miranda's office was a study in understated elegance. Original artwork, furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries, windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. It was beautiful and sterile, much like the life she'd built around her family's expectations. "The Morrison project is moving forward on schedule," her assistant was saying, but Miranda's attention had drifted to the street below. Even from 40 floors up, she could see the contrasts that defined their city. Gleaming office buildings casting shadows over tent cities. Designer boutiques next to boarded-up storefronts, wealth and poverty existing in uncomfortable proximity. "Miranda, the zoning committee meeting is in 10 minutes. Of course, thank you, Jennifer. Miranda gathered her files for another meeting. About another development project that would generate millions in profit while displacing hundreds of families. It was the family business, the source of wealth that funded her comfortable life and philanthropic efforts. The irony wasn't lost on her. She donated generously to homeless shelters while her family's projects created more homeless people. She tried to discuss this contradiction with her father, but Charles Ellison was a man who saw the world in terms of profit margins and market opportunities. Sentiment doesn't build buildings, Miranda. We provide luxury housing for people who can afford it. That's not charity, that's business. But Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of the problem they claimed to be solving through charitable donations. Her grandmother's journal, discovered after the old woman's death last year, had only deepened these doubts. Miranda Ellison had written extensively about using wealth responsibly, about the moral obligation that came with privilege. True philanthropy, one entry read, requires getting your hands dirty. It means understanding the people you claim to help, not just writing checks from a distance. Miranda had been trying to live by those words, quietly visiting the areas most affected by Ellison developments. She wore simple clothes, drove an unremarkable car, and tried to understand what their projects meant to the people who lived in their shadow. It was this unofficial research that had brought her to the downtown area this morning. She'd planned to walk through the neighborhood scheduled for their next luxury development, to see firsthand what would be demolished to make way for progress. She'd had no idea that a violent protest was about to erupt, or that her life was about to intersect with that of a maintenance worker who would challenge everything she thought she knew about sacrifice, integrity, and what it meant to truly help another human being. The first sign of trouble came at 11:47 a.m. when Daniel heard shouting from the street 23 floors below. He was replacing a faulty thermostat in one of the executive suites, his tools spread across the marble floor in careful order. The noise was faint at first, easily dismissed as typical city sounds. Construction crews, delivery trucks, the constant hum of urban life. But the shouting grew louder, more urgent. Daniel moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows and peered down at the street. What he saw made his blood run cold. A crowd had gathered at the intersection directly below the hotel, growing by the minute. Signs bobbed above the mass of people, though he couldn't read them from this height. Police cars lined the block, their red and blue lights painting the morning in sharp, anxious colors. Even through the thick glass, Daniel could hear the rising tension in the voices below. His radio crackled to life. All maintenance staff, remain at your current positions. We have a situation developing outside. Do not, repeat, do not approach the street-level exits. Frank's voice was tight with worry. Daniel had never heard his supervisor sound rattled, and that worried him more than the crowd below. He tried to focus on his work, but the noise kept drawing his attention back to the window. The protest, for that's clearly what it was, seemed to center around the construction site across the street. Daniel recognized it as one of the Ellison Corporation's luxury developments, a project that had been controversial from the start. The old buildings being demolished had housed dozens of families, most of whom couldn't afford to live anywhere else in the city. At street level, Miranda Ellison stood frozen on the sidewalk, her simple clothes and forgettable car having allowed her to blend into the neighborhood unnoticed. She'd been documenting the area with her phone, taking pictures of the small businesses and residential buildings that would soon be reduced to rubble for her family's profit. The protest had started peacefully. A small group of displaced residents and community activists had gathered to draw attention to the human cost of gentrification. But as word spread through social media, the crowd had swelled beyond what anyone had anticipated. And with the larger numbers came a different energy, one that crackled with potential violence. Miranda tried to move away from the growing chaos, but the crowd had surrounded her. Bodies pressed in from all sides, voices raised in anger at a system that seemed designed to crush the poor while enriching the wealthy. She found herself caught in a human tide that paid no attention to individual safety or comfort. Ellison Corporation destroys families, someone shouted near her ear. Housing is a human right, another voice called out. Miranda's throat tightened. These people were protesting her family's business practices, and they had every right to be angry. The Ellison developments displaced working families while creating housing that only the wealthy could afford. It was a business model that had made her family rich while making the housing crisis worse. The irony of being trapped in a protest against her own family's actions wasn't lost on her. She'd come here to better understand the impact of their developments, and now she was experiencing it firsthand. The situation deteriorated rapidly. What had begun as a peaceful demonstration descended into chaos when someone threw a bottle at the police line. The officers responded with tear gas, and suddenly the crowd was no longer unified in purpose, but united in panic. People ran in every direction, pushing and shoving in their desperation to escape the stinging chemical cloud. Miranda found herself swept along with the panicked mass, unable to control her direction or speed. She stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully as she fell. The crowd trampled around her, some people trying to help, others too focused on their own escape to notice someone down. Miranda covered her head with her arms as feet stepped on her legs, her back, her shoulders. Pain shot through her twisted ankle, and she realized with growing terror that she might be seriously injured or worse. From his perch 23 floors above, Daniel watched the chaos unfold with growing alarm. He could see people running, could see the tear gas spreading like a toxic fog. And then, through the confusion, he spotted someone on the ground near the hotel's entrance. A woman, down and vulnerable, being trampled by the panicked crowd. Daniel couldn't think. His body moved on instinct honed by 3 years of single parenthood, 3 years of protecting someone smaller and more vulnerable than himself. He dropped his tools and ran for the service elevator. Frank's voice crackled over the radio again. All staff maintain positions. Do not engage with the situation outside. Daniel turned off his radio. The elevator seemed to take forever to reach the ground floor. Daniel's hands clenched and unclenched as he watched the floor numbers tick down. Through the elevator's small window, he could see hotel staff gathered in the lobby, watching the chaos outside with a mixture of fascination and fear. The lobby. Doors were locked, the hotel in full security mode. Daniel didn't have the authority to override the lockdown, but he knew the building better than almost anyone. The service entrance in the basement connected to a loading dock that opened onto the alley beside the hotel. He took the elevator down one more floor and ran through the basement corridors, past storage rooms and mechanical equipment to the service door. The loading dock was empty. The usual delivery trucks nowhere to be seen. Even from the alley, Daniel could hear the chaos on the main street. He rounded the corner of the building and plunged into the crowd. The tear gas burned his eyes and throat, but Daniel pushed forward. He could see the woman clearly now, dark hair, simple clothes curled on the ground, trying to protect herself from the stampeding feet. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead. Daniel threw himself over her, using his body as a shield. His broad shoulders took the impact as people ran past, some stumbling over them, others managing to step around. He wrapped his arms around the woman's head and shoulders, protecting her from the worst of it. "Stay down!" he shouted over the noise. "I've got you." Miranda looked up into the face of her rescuer, a man she'd never seen before, with kind eyes and a face tight with determination. He was risking his own safety to protect her, and she didn't even know his name. The worst of the crowd passed over and around them. Daniel helped Miranda to her feet, supporting her weight, when she winced at putting pressure on her injured ankle. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so. My ankle—" "I'll help you." He guided her away from the continuing chaos, toward the relative safety of the hotel's side entrance. Miranda leaned heavily on his strong arm, acutely aware that this stranger was the only reason she wasn't lying unconscious or worse in the street. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know what would have happened if—" Don't think about it. We need to get you checked out. That ankle might be broken. They reached the service entrance, but Daniel's keycard wouldn't work. The lockdown had disabled all but the highest level access codes. Through the reinforced glass, they could see hotel security watching them. "Daniel Vega, maintenance," Daniel called out, showing his ID badge. "I have an injured woman here. She needs medical attention." The security guard shook his head and pointed to his radio, indicating he was following orders. No one in or out until the all-clear was given. Miranda reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out her own ID. When the security guard saw the name Miranda Ellison, his expression changed immediately. The doors opened within seconds. "Ms. Ellison, are you hurt? Should we call an ambulance?" Miranda looked at Daniel, seeing the confusion in his eyes as he processed her name. Ellison, as in Ellison Corporation, as in the very family whose business practices had sparked today's protest. "Just some ice for my ankle," she said quietly. "And please make sure this man is recognized for his heroism. He risked his life to help me." But Daniel had gone very still beside her. His kind eyes had hardened, and Miranda could see the exact moment when he realized who she was, who her family was, what her last name meant to the people who'd been protesting outside. The hotel manager appeared, flustered and agitated. "Miss Ellison, we're so sorry about this situation. The protesters have been cleared, and we're reviewing our security protocols." "Where's Vega?" Frank Martinez's voice cut through the lobby. "Daniel Vega, you better have a damn good explanation for abandoning your post." Daniel turned to face his supervisor, his shoulders straight despite everything that had just happened. "I saw someone in trouble. I helped. You violated direct orders. You left your assigned position during a security lockdown. You put yourself and this hotel at risk." "I saved someone's life." Frank glanced at Miranda, recognizing her importance to the hotel's relationship with the Ellison family. His expression shifted, calculating the political implications of the situation. "Ms. Ellison, we apologize for any inconvenience caused by our employees' actions. Rest assured, this breach of protocol will be addressed." Miranda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She could see where this was leading, could see the machinery of corporate politics beginning to turn. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began. But Frank was already reaching for Daniel's radio and keycard. "You're terminated, Vega. Effective immediately. Clear out your locker and be off the property in 15 minutes. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Terminated, fired, no job, no insurance, no way to pay rent or buy groceries or keep Emma in school. "Frank, you can't." "I can and I am. You abandoned your post. You violated security protocols. You're done." Miranda watched in horror as the man who had just saved her life was stripped of his livelihood. The injustice was staggering, but she could see in Daniel's face that her intervention would only make things worse for him. Daniel handed over his radio and keycard without another word. His pride wouldn't let him argue, wouldn't let him beg, for a job that had just been taken from him for doing the right thing. He looked at Miranda one last time, and she saw something die in those kind eyes. The realization that she represented everything that was wrong with the world he was trying to navigate. That her privilege had cost him everything, even as he'd risked everything to protect her. "Take care of that ankle," he said quietly, and walked toward the elevator that would carry him away from the only steady job he'd had in years. Miranda stood in the opulent hotel lobby, surrounded by concerned staff and security personnel, and felt more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. The hospital bracelet on her wrist from the quick medical check felt like a badge of shame, physical evidence of the moment when one man's decency had collided with a system designed to punish the powerless. Outside, the protesters had dispersed, but the damage was done. To the neighborhood, to the families facing displacement, and to Daniel Vega, whose only crime had been treating a stranger's life as more important than corporate protocol. Miranda knew she had to do something, but as she watched Daniel disappear into the elevator, She realized she had no idea how to bridge the vast gulf between her world and his, or whether a man who had just lost everything because of her would ever trust her enough to let her try. The eviction notice arrived 3 days after Daniel lost his job, delivered by a tired-looking postal worker who apologized for the bad news as if it were somehow his fault. Daniel stared at the official document with its bold red lettering and precise legal language that boiled down to a simple, devastating reality. 30 days to pay 3 months back rent or find somewhere else to live. Emma was at school, blissfully unaware that their small world was crumbling around them. Daniel was grateful for that mercy at least. She didn't need to see him sitting at their kitchen table with his head in his hands, surrounded by bills he couldn't pay and job applications that seemed to disappear into a void. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Without his hotel paycheck, they had exactly $437 in their checking account. Rent was $850 a month, and they were already behind. The electric bill was overdue. Emma needed new shoes for school, and her science fair project still required supplies they couldn't afford. Daniel had spent the past 72 hours making phone calls and visiting potential employers. The construction companies weren't hiring. The apartment complexes already had maintenance staff. The hotels, well, word traveled fast in the hospitality industry, and nobody wanted to hire someone who'd been terminated for abandoning his post, no matter the circumstances. Previous employer terminated your employment? The question came up in every interview, spoken with the kind of polite suspicion that meant the conversation was effectively over. Daniel had tried explaining about the protest, about helping an injured woman, about doing what any decent person would do in that situation. But explanations sounded like excuses, and excuses didn't get you hired. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson next door. "Emma's at my place doing homework. Sweet girl, don't you worry, Daniel. Something will turn up. Something will turn up." Daniel appreciated the sentiment, but 73-year-old optimism didn't pay rent or put food on the table. He needed work, and he needed it fast. The phone rang, startling him from his dark thoughts. An unknown number with a local area code. "Hello? Mr. Vega? This is Jennifer Walsh from Ellison Corporation. Ms. Miranda Ellison would like to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. Miranda Ellison, the woman whose life he'd saved and whose family name had cost him everything. What could she possibly want with him now? "I'm not interested in charity," he said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "Ms. Ellison was very specific that this isn't charity, Mr. Vega. She has a business proposition she'd like to discuss. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you?" A business proposition. Daniel's first instinct was to hang up, to preserve what little dignity he had left. But dignity didn't pay bills, and Emma's future was more important than his wounded pride. Where and when? The Riverside Cafe on 3rd Street. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Ms. Ellison will be waiting for you. After hanging up, Daniel sat in the silence of their small apartment and tried to imagine what Miranda Ellison could possibly want to discuss. In his experience, rich people didn't do business with unemployed maintenance workers unless they needed someone desperate enough to work. For nothing. But he would go. For Emma's sake, he would swallow his pride and listen to whatever offer the heir to a real estate empire had to make. Meanwhile, across town in her glass tower office, Miranda ended the call and immediately second-guessed her decision to reach out. What was she planning to say to Daniel Vega? How could she possibly explain that his sacrifice had haunted her for 3 sleepless nights, that she couldn't stop thinking about the injustice of his termination? Her father's voice echoed in her memory from their heated argument the night before. "You can't save everyone, Miranda. The man made his choice when he abandoned his duties. What happened to him after that isn't our responsibility, but it felt like their responsibility. More than that, it felt like her responsibility." Daniel had lost his job protecting her, and the least she could do was try to make that right somehow. The problem was figuring out how to help without making him feel like a charity case. Miranda had grown up around enough wealthy people to understand the delicate psychology of assistance. Offer too little, and it was insulting. Offer too much, and it became demeaning. The key was finding something that felt like genuine opportunity rather than guilt-driven handouts. She'd spent the morning reviewing her family's various business interests, looking for legitimate positions that might suit someone with Daniel's background and work ethic. The Ellison Corporation owned dozens of properties throughout the city, many of which required skilled maintenance staff. But offering him another maintenance job felt hollow, almost cruel. He'd lost his previous position because of her family. Simply providing him with another similar job wouldn't address the larger issues at play. Miranda pulled out her grandmother's journal, a leather-bound book that had become her moral compass in recent months. Miranda Ellison had written extensively about the responsibility that came with inherited wealth, about the importance of using privilege to create meaningful change rather than simply maintaining the status quo. True philanthropy, one entry read, isn't about giving money to problems. It's about understanding problems well enough to solve them at their source. Miranda had been thinking about that entry for weeks, particularly as she'd walked through neighborhoods affected by Ellison developments. The housing crisis wasn't just about a lack of affordable units. It was about the systematic displacement of communities, the destruction of social networks that help people survive economic hardship. What if there was a way to address those problems directly? What if Daniel's expertise in building maintenance could be part of a larger solution? An idea began to form, tentative but increasingly compelling. Miranda pulled out a legal pad and began sketching out concepts for a different kind of housing project. Not luxury developments that displaced families, but supportive housing that gave them stability. Not warehousing people in institutional shelters, but creating communities with dignity and hope. She'd need someone who understood buildings, who understood the daily needs of working families, who had credibility with the communities most affected by the housing crisis. Someone like Daniel Vega. By the time Jennifer knocked on her office door to remind her about another meeting, Miranda had filled 3 pages with notes and rough calculations. The idea was ambitious, probably idealistic, and would certainly face resistance from her family, but it felt right in a way that nothing else had in years. Jennifer, cancel my afternoon meetings tomorrow and see if you can pull together some preliminary research on supportive housing models in other cities. I want to know what's been tried, what's worked, and what hasn't. Of course, Miss Ellison. Should I ask what this is regarding? Miranda looked out her office window at the city below, thinking about a maintenance worker who'd risked everything to help a stranger, and about her grandmother's belief that privilege came with obligations. It's regarding doing the right thing, she said. Finally. The leather-bound journal felt heavy in Miranda's hands as she sat in her penthouse apartment that evening, reading her grandmother's words by lamplight. Miranda Ellison had written this particular entry in 1987, during the height of the city's last major housing crisis. I walked through the tent cities today, the elegant handwriting read. Charles thinks I'm being dramatic, but I needed to see what our developments have displaced. The Riverside project will house 300 wealthy families and remove 500 poor ones. The mathematics of progress, he calls it. But mathematics don't capture the human cost. The grandmother who's lived in the same neighborhood for 40 years, the children who must change schools, the small businesses that lose their customer base. We are not just building luxury apartments, we are dismantling communities. Miranda closed the journal and walked to her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Daniel Vega was probably lying awake wondering how he'd pay next month's rent. Somewhere out there, families were being priced out of neighborhoods their grandparents had helped build. Her grandmother had seen this cycle decades ago, had recognized the pattern of displacement that enriched developers while impoverishing communities. But Eleanor had been limited by the social expectations of her time, able to document the problems, but not to challenge them directly. Miranda had no such limitations. She had inherited not just wealth, but the freedom to use it as she saw fit. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. Board meeting moved to Thursday. We need to discuss the Morrison project timeline. Also, heard you've been asking about housing research. Hope you're not going soft on me. Miranda smiled grimly. If going soft meant caring about the human impact of their business decisions, then yes, she was definitely going soft. The next morning, Daniel stood outside the Riverside Cafe 15 minutes early, his best shirt pressed and his work boots polished to a shine that couldn't quite hide their age. He debated what to wear to meet with one of the city's most powerful women, finally settling on the clothes that represented who he actually was rather than trying to pretend to be someone else. Emma had asked why he was dressed up, and he'd told her he had an important meeting about work. Her face had lit up with hope that still made his chest ache. Will you get a good job, Daddy? One where you don't have to work such long hours? We'll see, Mija. We'll see. Through the cafe window, Daniel spotted Miranda immediately. She sat at a corner table, dressed simply in jeans and a blue sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Without the designer clothes and professional makeup he'd expected, she looked younger, more approachable, almost like someone who might understand what it meant to worry about money, almost. Daniel pushed through the cafe door, the bell chiming his arrival. Miranda looked up and smiled, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Mr. Vega, thank you for coming. Ms. Ellison. Daniel sat carefully, acutely aware of the other cafe patrons who might recognize the Ellison name if they overheard the conversation. Please call me Miranda, and thank you again for what you did during the protest. I know it cost you your job. Daniel's jaw tightened. You didn't ask me here to apologize. Your assistant said something about a business proposition. Miranda reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the table between them. You're right. I asked you here because I have an idea, and I think you might be the right person to help me implement it. I'm listening. Miranda opened the folder, revealing architectural sketches and printed research articles. How much do you know about supportive housing? Not much. Sounds like a fancy term for homeless shelters. It's different. Supportive housing provides permanent, affordable apartments combined with on-site services, job training, childcare, mental health support, financial counseling. The idea is to address not just the symptom of homelessness, but the underlying causes. Daniel studied the sketches, recognizing the practical elements of good building design alongside features he'd never seen in low-income housing. Community spaces, children's play areas, gardens. Looks expensive, he said. It is, initially, but the long-term savings are significant. Less emergency room usage, fewer police calls, higher employment rates among residents. Most importantly, it works. Cities that have invested in supportive housing have seen dramatic reductions in chronic homelessness. And you want to build something like this? Miranda leaned forward, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. I want to build several somethings like this. A network of supportive housing communities throughout the city, designed with dignity and hope instead of just efficiency and cost-cutting. Daniel set down the sketches and looked at her directly. Ms. Ellison, Miranda, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm a maintenance worker, not a social worker. I don't know anything about running programs or managing services, but you know buildings. You know what breaks down and what lasts. You know what it's like to worry about making rent and keeping the lights on. Miranda's voice grew more passionate. Most supportive housing fails because it's designed by people who've never lived in it, managed by people who've never struggled financially, and built by contractors who see poor people as a market rather than a community. Daniel felt something stir in his chest, not quite hope, but curiosity. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we partner to create something different. You would oversee the construction and ongoing maintenance of the properties. But more than that, you'd help design them. Your input on what families actually need, what works in practice rather than just on paper. And what do you get out of it? Miranda was quiet for a moment, considering the question. A chance to use my family's wealth for something other than making more wealth. A chance to honor my grandmother's belief that privilege comes with obligations. She pulled out the leather journal and opened it to a marked page. She wrote this in 1987. We are not just building luxury apartments. We are dismantling communities. I don't want to spend my life dismantling communities. I want to build them. Daniel read the passage, struck by the elegant handwriting and the moral clarity of the words. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, but she was also constrained by her time and her circumstances. I'm not. And your family? They're on board with this plan? Miranda's smile was rueful. My family thinks I'm going through a phase. They expect me to come to my senses and get back to the business of maximizing profits. Are you going through a phase? 3 days ago, a man risked his job to save my life. He didn't know who I was or whether I could help him in return. He just saw someone in trouble and acted. Miranda met Daniel's eyes. That's not a phase. That's a reminder of who I want to be. Daniel studied the woman across from him, trying to reconcile the idealistic words with the reality of inherited wealth and corporate power. This is a nice dream, Miranda, but dreams don't pay rent. I have a daughter to support, and I need steady income, not a social experiment that might fail. I understand. That's why I'm proposing to start with a salary, $60,000 a year, plus health insurance and a housing allowance. If the project succeeds, there would be equity participation and performance bonuses. Daniel's breath caught. $60,000 was more than he'd ever made in his life, more than he'd dared to dream possible without a college degree. Why me? He asked quietly. You could hire anyone, experienced developers, non-profit managers, people with credentials, because credentialed people designed the system that's failing, because experienced developers are part of the problem we're trying to solve. Miranda closed the journal and looked out the cafe window. Because 3 days ago you showed me what integrity looks like, and I think that's more valuable than any credential. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and pitfalls. It was an incredible opportunity, almost too good to be true, which in his experience usually meant it was. I need to think about it, he said finally. In course, take all the time you need. Miranda gathered her papers and stood. But Daniel, don't let fear of failure keep you from trying. Some things are worth the risk. As Miranda left the cafe, Daniel remained at the table, staring at the architectural sketches she'd left behind. The designs showed buildings that looked like homes rather than institutions, communities rather than warehouses for poor people. For the first time in 3 days, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. A future where Emma could be proud of the work her father did, where helping people was part of the job description rather than a violation of company protocol. It was a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that made failure hurt even more. But as Daniel walked home through neighborhoods marked for demolition by Ellison developments, he began to think that some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was watching the world get a little colder, a little less human, one eviction notice at a time. Daniel spent that night sitting at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, drawing up his own plans. Not architectural blueprints like Miranda's elegant sketches, but something more practical. A rough business plan written in pencil with calculations in the margins and question marks scattered throughout. $60,000 a year. The number seemed almost fictional, like something from a different person's life. But Daniel had learned not to trust things that seemed too good to be true, especially when they came from people who lived in 40-floor penthouses. He'd done his research after leaving the cafe, spending 2 hours at the public library reading about supportive housing projects across the country. The success stories were encouraging: reduced homelessness, improved health outcomes, families getting back on their feet. But the failures were sobering. Projects that ran out of funding, communities that rejected them, good intentions that couldn't survive political pressure or economic reality. Emma was asleep in the bedroom, her science fair volcano finally completed. With baking soda Daniel had bought, using their last $10. She'd been so proud of her work, carefully explaining the chemical reactions to Mrs. Patterson next door, who'd listened with the patience of someone who understood that encouragement was sometimes the most valuable gift you could give a child. "Daddy, will you be there for my presentation?" Emma had asked as he tucked her in. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Mika, but would he be there? If he took Miranda's offer and it failed, would he be able to keep that promise? Or would he be back to working multiple jobs just to keep them housed and fed?" Daniel's phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello, Daniel. This is Father Miguel from St. Catherine's. I hope I'm not calling too late." Daniel glanced at the clock, 9:30 p.m. "No, Father, not too late. Is everything okay? I was hoping I could ask you the same thing. Maria Santos mentioned that you might be going through some employment difficulties." Maria Santos ran the church's food pantry and had a network of information that rivaled the FBI. If she knew about Daniel's job situation, half the parish probably knew by now. "I'm handling it, Father." "I'm sure you are. But I wanted you to know that if you need help, with rent, with groceries, with anything, the church has resources." Daniel's pride bristled, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "I appreciate that, but we're okay." "Of course, but Daniel, accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. It's recognition that we're all part of a community, and communities take care of their own." After hanging up, Daniel stared at the eviction notice still lying on the counter. 3 weeks remaining to pay what he owed or find somewhere else to live. The church's offer was generous, but charity felt different when you'd been self-sufficient your entire adult life. Miranda's offer, though, that was work. A chance to earn his way forward rather than just survive on the kindness of others. He picked up his pencil and started writing again, this time not calculating risks but imagining possibilities. What would supportive housing look like if it were designed by someone who'd actually needed support? What services would matter most to a single parent working 2 jobs just to afford a 1-bedroom apartment? The next morning, Daniel called the number on Miranda's business card. "Ellison Corporation, how may I help you?" "This is Daniel Vega. I'd like to speak with Miranda Ellison about our discussion yesterday." "One moment, please." The hold music was classical, something elegant and expensive sounding. Daniel found himself wondering if rich people actually chose their hold music or if it just came standard with wealth. "Daniel," Miranda's voice was warm with anticipation, "have you made a decision? I'd like to discuss terms, and I have some conditions." "I'm listening. First, I want a 6-month trial period. If this doesn't work out, I need to know I can leave without burning bridges." "That's reasonable." "Second, I want to be involved in the planning from the beginning. Real involvement, not just token consultation." "Absolutely. That's exactly what I was hoping for." "Third, if we're going to do this, we do it right. No cutting corners on quality just because we're building for poor people. No institutional furniture or industrial lighting or any of that nonsense that makes people feel like they're being warehoused." Miranda's voice was warm with approval. "You sound like my grandmother. She always said that dignity was the most important feature of any building." "When do we start?" "How about this afternoon? I found a potential site for our first project. Would you like to take a look?" 2 hours later, Daniel met Miranda in front of a 4-story brick building in the Riverside district, one of the neighborhoods most affected by gentrification pressure. The building had been empty for 2 years, its windows boarded up and its facade tagged with graffiti. "It used to be a textile factory," Miranda explained as they stood on the sidewalk. "Built in 1924, solid construction. The zoning allows for residential conversion." Daniel walked around the building's perimeter, his trained eye cataloging both problems and possibilities. The brick was sound, the foundation looked solid, and the high ceilings would allow for creative interior design. Plumbing will need to be completely redone, he said. Electrical too. The windows are original. They could be restored, but it would be expensive. What about the bones of the building? Daniel smiled at the question. The bones are good. This was built to last. They spent an hour touring the interior, flashlights cutting through the dusty darkness. Miranda took notes, while Daniel pointed out structural elements, potential challenges, and opportunities for innovation. The ground floor could be community space, Miranda suggested. Childcare center, meeting rooms, maybe a small grocery store, job training center, Daniel added, and a maintenance workshop where residents could learn basic repair skills. I like that. What about the upper floors? 40 units, maybe 50 if we're clever about the layout. Mix of one-bedroom and two-bedroom apartments. Each floor needs a community kitchen and laundry facility. Miranda was sketching rapidly in a notebook, her business plan taking physical shape as they explored. What would something like this cost? Daniel considered the scope of work, the quality standards. They discussed the neighborhood market rates. Done right, probably $3 million for acquisition and renovation. That's manageable. Daniel stopped walking and looked at her. $3 million is manageable. Miranda seemed surprised by his reaction. The Morrison project, the luxury development my family is building downtown, costs $32 million. For housing that will be empty most of the year because it's priced as investment property rather than actual homes. And your family is okay with you spending $3 million on a supportive housing project? Miranda's expression grew more serious. My family doesn't know about this project yet. This is my money from my grandmother's estate. They're not going to approve. They don't have to. My grandmother left me enough to fund several projects like this, along with a letter explaining that she trusted me to use the money wisely. Miranda looked around the empty factory space. I think she'd approve of this. Daniel found himself believing her, despite his ingrained skepticism about the motivations of wealthy people. There was something genuine in Miranda's enthusiasm, something that reminded him of Emma's excitement about her science project, the joy of creating something meaningful from raw materials and determination. Okay, he said finally, let's do this. Just like that, but I have one more condition. What's that? We start with a community meeting. Before we design anything, before we finalize any plans, we talk to the people who live in this neighborhood. We find out what they actually need, not what we think they need. Miranda extended her hand for a shake. Deal, as they walked back. To their cars, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about work that mattered, about building something that would improve lives rather than just generate profit. For the first time since the protest, he began to believe that losing his hotel job might have been the best thing that could have happened to him. The community meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the basement of St. Catherine's Church, the same church where Father Miguel had offered help Daniel wasn't ready to accept. The turnout surprised both Daniel and Miranda, nearly 40 residents. Packed into the modest space, some bringing children who played quietly in the back while their parents discussed the future of their neighborhood. Miranda had insisted on bringing an easel and poster boards, but Daniel had convinced her to start with simple conversation instead. People don't trust presentations, he told her. They trust listening. The architectural sketches lay flat on a table near the front of the room, waiting to be shared after the real work was done. Understanding what the community actually needed. Most of you know me, Daniel began, standing in front of the gathered neighbors. I've lived in this area for 3 years with my daughter Emma. I recently lost my job, and I'm here because someone offered me an opportunity that could help not just my family, but all of our families. He gestured to Miranda, who sat in the front row looking more nervous than he'd ever seen her. This is Miranda Ellison. Yes, that Ellison. And before you decide what that means, I'd like you to hear what she has to say. Miranda stood slowly, her usual confidence replaced by something more humble. I know my family's name isn't popular in this neighborhood. Our developments have displaced families, driven up rents, and changed communities in ways that haven't always been positive. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman Daniel knew from the grocery store, spoke up from the middle of the room. "So why should we trust you now?" "Because I think you shouldn't," Miranda said, surprising everyone, including Daniel. "Trust should be earned, not inherited. I'm here to listen first and prove myself through actions, not words." For the next hour, the conversation flowed around the room like water finding its level. Parents talked about childcare challenges and the lack of safe places for children to play. Working adults discussed the difficulty of finding stable housing they could afford on service industry wages. Elderly residents spoke about feeling isolated as long-time neighbors moved away or were priced out. Rosa Martinez, a single mother who cleaned offices downtown, raised her hand. "My son is 8, same age as your daughter, Daniel. After school, he has to come home to an empty apartment because I can't afford after-school care. He's too young to be alone, but what choice do I have?" Daniel felt the familiar ache of single parent guilt. "Emma goes to Mrs. Patterson next door. She's retired and doesn't charge much, but I know not everyone has that option." "What if childcare was part of the housing?" Miranda asked quietly. "What if there was a safe place for children, after school, run by residents who were trained and paid to provide that service?" The conversation shifted as people began to see possibilities rather than just problems. Maria Santos, the food pantry coordinator, suggested a community garden. James Williams, a carpenter who'd been laid off from a construction job, talked about a workshop where residents could learn maintenance skills and earn money doing repairs for the broader community. "The key," said Father Miguel, who'd been listening from the back of the room, "is dignity. People don't need charity. They need opportunity." Miranda took notes throughout the discussion, but Daniel could see her doing something more important. She was learning that poverty wasn't a moral failing but a systemic problem. Learning that poor people weren't lacking in ideas or ambition, but in resources and opportunities. When Miranda finally unveiled the architectural sketches, the reaction was immediate and emotional. The designs showed spaces that looked like homes, rather than institutional housing, with large windows, community gathering areas, and green spaces where children could play safely. "The ground floor would house the childcare center," Miranda explained, "along with the community workshop, a small health clinic, and office space for services like job counseling and financial planning." "Who pays for all this?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez, her voice skeptical but interested. "I do," Miranda said simply. "This is an investment in the community, not a profit-making venture." "And when you get tired of playing social worker?" The question came from Tony Valdez, a man Daniel recognized as someone who'd been evicted from his apartment when their building was sold to developers. "When you decide this isn't fun anymore, what happens to the families who depend on these services?" It was a fair question, one that Daniel had been wrestling with himself. Miranda's answer surprised him. "That's why we're structuring this as a community land trust," she said. "The building will be owned collectively by the residents. After the initial investment, the community controls its own future." Daniel looked at her sharply. This was the first he'd heard about community ownership, and it changed everything about the project's long-term sustainability. After the meeting, Daniel and Miranda sat in his car outside the church, debriefing. "The evening's discussions. Community land trust?" Daniel asked. "When did you decide on that?" "About halfway through the meeting," Miranda admitted. "Listening to Tony's question made me realize that this only works if the community has real control. Otherwise, it's just benevolent dictatorship. Your family is really not going to like this." Miranda laughed. but there was tension in the sound. "My father called this afternoon. Word is getting around about our partnership. He's concerned about the family's reputation." "What did you tell him?" "That our reputation could use some improvement." Daniel studied her profile in the dim streetlight. "You're burning bridges, Miranda. Once you do this, there's no going back to the way things were." "Good," she said firmly. "The way things were wasn't working." They spent another hour in the car, refining their plans based on the community input. The childcare center would be staffed by residents who received training and certification. The community workshop would offer both education and employment opportunities. The health clinic would focus on preventive care and mental health support. This is bigger than just housing, Daniel realized. We're talking about rebuilding the entire support system that used to exist in stable communities. Exactly. Housing is just the foundation. The real work is creating connections between people, giving them reasons to invest in each other's success. Daniel found himself thinking about Emma, about the kind of community he wanted her to grow up in. Not just a place where they could afford to live, but a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where children had multiple adults who cared about their well-being, where people had opportunities to build better lives. "I have one more condition," he said. "What's that?" "Emma and I get to be the first residents. If this is going to work, I need to know it works for my family." Miranda smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he'd seen from her all evening. "I was hoping you'd say that." As Daniel drove home through streets that would soon be transformed by their shared vision, he thought about the architectural sketches folded in his jacket pocket. They weren't just blueprints anymore, they were promises. Promises to families like Rosa Martinez's, to children like Emma, to a community that had been overlooked for too long. The sketches represented something Daniel had never dared to imagine, a future where doing the right thing and making a living weren't mutually exclusive, where helping people was the job description rather than a violation of company policy. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel Vega was excited to go to work. The private investigator's report arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to Miranda's office in a manila envelope marked confidential. She'd hired the firm 3 weeks earlier, not to investigate Daniel. She trusted her instincts about his character, but to conduct due diligence on the riverside property and the surrounding area. What she found inside the envelope changed everything. Miranda stared at the photographs and documents spread across her desk, her coffee growing cold as the full scope of her family's deception became clear. The protest that had brought her and Daniel together hadn't been a spontaneous community response to gentrification. It had been orchestrated, planned, and funded by Ellison Corporation as part of a complex scheme to manipulate property values and eliminate business competition. The evidence was damning and thorough. Bank records showing payments to community organizers who had actually been hired agitators. Text messages between her father and his business partners discussing timing and crowd control. Police reports that had been mysteriously buried or delayed. Phase 1 complete. Read one internal memo dated the day after the protest. Target property values decreased by estimated 15 to 20%. Acquisition window open for Morrison expansion. Miranda felt sick. The violent chaos she'd witnessed, the terror of being trapped in a panicking crowd, Daniel's sacrifice and subsequent firing, all of it had been theater designed to serve her family's financial interests. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Buried in the investigator's report was a section titled Collateral Damage Assessment. It detailed the aftermath of the artificial protest. 3 people hospitalized, 17 arrests, 5 local businesses forced to close due to property damage, and dozens of workers terminated for various reasons related to the incident. Daniel's name appeared on a list titled Successfully Terminated Personnel. Next to it was a notation that made Miranda's blood run cold. Subject positioned for recruitment to Morrison Project Community Liaison role, pending adequate desperation period. They had planned to destroy Daniel's life and then offer him a job. Miranda's hands shook as she reached for her phone to call her father, then stopped. Charles Ellison's secretary would simply schedule a meeting for later in the week. Her father would have time to prepare explanations, to spin the situation in a way that made corporate sense. Instead, Miranda gathered the documents and walked directly to the executive elevator that served only the top 3 floors of the Ellison building. She found her father in his corner office, reviewing blueprints for the Morrison project with 2 men she recognized as city planning officials. "Gentlemen," Charles Ellison said smoothly, looking up from the plans, "could you give us a moment? Family business." After the officials left, Charles gestured for Miranda to sit, but she remained standing. "You orchestrated the protest," she said without preamble. Her father's expression didn't change. "I assume you have questions about something you think you've discovered." Miranda dropped the investigator's report on his desk. "I have questions about something I know you did." Charles glanced at the documents without picking them up. "Business is complicated, Miranda. Sometimes market conditions need to be influenced." "Market conditions? 3 people were hospitalized. A man lost his job for helping me. A man lost his job for abandoning his post. The fact that you were involved was coincidental." "Coincidental?" Miranda's voice rose. "You planned to hire him afterward. You calculated his desperation as part of your strategy." For the first time, Charles looked uncomfortable. The Morrison project requires community liaisons who understand the demographic we're trying to reach. Vega would have been well compensated for his services after you destroyed his life first, after market forces created an opportunity that benefited everyone involved. Miranda stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. This wasn't a moral failing or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was how Charles Ellison conducted business, manipulating people and circumstances to generate profit regardless of the human cost. "The supportive housing project is cancelled," Charles said, his tone shifting to what Miranda recognized as his final decision voice. "I've been patient with your philanthropic phase, but this fantasy about reforming the housing market ends now. You can't cancel it. I'm funding it with grandmother's money. Money that came from Ellison Corporation profits. Money that belongs to this family and this business." Charles stood and moved to the window, his back to Miranda. "You're young, idealistic. I understand the appeal of these social justice causes. But you're also an Ellison, and that comes with responsibilities. Responsibilities to whom? To the families we displace, to the communities we destroy, to the shareholders who depend on our profits, to the employees whose jobs exist because we generate revenue, to the economic system that allows people like your Daniel Vega to exist at all." Miranda felt something cold and final settle in her chest. People like Daniel Vega don't exist because of our economic system. They exist in spite of it. Don't be naive, Miranda. Vega is exactly where he belongs in the economic order. We offered him a chance to improve his position by working with us rather than against us. He should be grateful. Grateful that you orchestrated his firing so you could exploit his desperation. Charles turned back to face her, his expression hardening. Grateful that we noticed him at all. Do you have any idea how many Daniel Vegas there are in this city? How many struggling single fathers who would jump at the chance to earn steady money working for Ellison Corporation? That's not the point. That's exactly the point. Individual suffering is irrelevant. What matters is the system, the structure, the engine that drives prosperity for the greatest number of people. Miranda gathered the investigator's report from his desk. And if that engine runs on human misery, then we make sure we're the ones driving it instead of being crushed under its wheels. Walking back to her office, Miranda felt the weight of her entire worldview shifting. Everything she'd believed about her family's business, everything she'd told herself about working within the system to create change, had been built on lies and deliberate manipulation. But worse than her father's cynicism was the realization that she'd been complicit. Every Ellison Corporation board meeting she'd attended, every profit report she'd approved, every luxury development she'd endorsed had been part of this same system of exploitation. She thought about Daniel, about his quiet dignity in the face of unjust termination, about his concern for Emma's future even as his own world collapsed. He'd risked everything to protect a stranger, never knowing that the stranger was part of the system that had been designed to exploit people exactly like him. Miranda picked up her phone and dialed Daniel's number. "Miranda, is everything okay? We need to meet tonight. There's something you need to know about the protest, about why you were really fired." "What do you mean?" Miranda looked out her office window at the city below, at the Morrison project, construction site where luxury apartments would soon rise from the carefully engineered chaos of 3 weeks ago. "I mean, my family orchestrated the whole thing, the protest, your firing, everything. And they planned to hire you afterward, once you were desperate enough to accept whatever they offered." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Miranda wondered if the call had been dropped. "Daniel, I'm here." His voice was very quiet. "Are you telling me that you knew that this whole supportive housing project is some kind of elaborate setup?" "No, I swear to you, I had no idea until this morning. I hired an investigator to research the property, and he uncovered the whole scheme." "An investigator?" Daniel's voice was flat now, emotionless. "Because you didn't trust me. Because I wanted to make sure we were making good decisions with the community's trust. Because I wanted to be thorough. And instead you discovered that your family destroyed my life as a business strategy." Miranda closed her eyes. "Yes, I need time to think about this. Daniel, please, we can still move forward with the project. We can expose what they did, make sure it never happens again. With what credibility? Who's going to trust an Ellison to fight against Ellison Corporation? Who's going to believe that you're different from your father when you have access to the same resources, the same power, the same ability to manipulate people's lives?" The line went dead, leaving Miranda alone in her glass tower office with the truth of what her family had done and the growing certainty that she'd lost the only partnership that had ever meant anything to her. Outside her window, the Morrison project continued its steady rise into the sky, each floor a monument to the kind of progress that crushed individuals in service of larger economic forces. For the first time in her life, Miranda Ellison understood what it meant to be truly alone. Daniel didn't answer his phone for 3 days. Miranda called 17 times, left 8 voicemails, and even drove to his apartment building twice. But he was either not home or not answering his door. She understood his anger, understood his sense of betrayal, but with each passing hour, the silence felt more final. On Friday evening, she found herself sitting in the Riverside Cafe where they'd first discussed their partnership, staring at the legal documents she'd been gathering. All week, evidence of her family's corruption spread across the small table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed an ugly picture. Bank records showing payments to fake grassroots organizers, text messages between her father and city officials discussing favorable zoning decisions, police reports that had been delayed or buried entirely, email chains detailing the systematic manipulation of property values through artificially created civil unrest. The investigator had been thorough, perhaps more thorough than Miranda had wanted. Every document told the same story. Ellison Corporation had turned human desperation into a business strategy, and they'd been doing it for years. Miranda's phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Board meeting Monday 9 a.m. Your presence required. Time to end this social experiment." She set the phone aside and continued organizing the evidence. If Charles Ellison thought she was going to quietly return to the family business, he was about to discover how wrong he could be. The cafe door chimed, and Miranda looked up to see Emma Vega walking in with an elderly woman she recognized as Mrs. Patterson from the community meeting. The little girl spotted Miranda immediately and broke into a bright smile. "Miss Miranda, are you having coffee with my daddy?" Mrs. Patterson put a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "Careful, Misha. The lady might be busy." Miranda's heart ached looking at Emma's expectant face. "Your daddy isn't here tonight, sweetheart, but would you like to sit with me for a minute?" Emma looked up at Mrs. Patterson, who nodded permission. The little girl climbed into the chair. Across from Miranda, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Daddy says you and him are going to build houses for families. Is that true?" Miranda glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who was watching the interaction with the careful attention of someone who'd raised children and grandchildren. "We're trying to." "Yes. Daddy's been sad since Tuesday. He won't tell me why, but I can tell. He gets quiet when he's worried about grown-up things." The innocence in Emma's voice was devastating. This child had no idea that her father's entire world had been manipulated by corporate greed, that his sacrifice during the protest had been part of someone else's business plan. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems," Miranda said carefully. "Is that why you look sad too?" Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat gently. "Emma, we should let Miss Miranda finish her work." "It's okay," Miranda said. "Actually, Emma, can I ask you something? What would you want in a place where families could live together and help each other?" Emma's face lit up with the question. "A really good playground, and a library where kids could do homework, and maybe a garden where people could grow vegetables like my abuela used to do. Those sound like wonderful ideas. And jobs for the mums and dads, so they don't have to worry so much about money." The simple wisdom of a child's perspective cut through all the complex legal and financial planning Miranda had been wrestling with. This wasn't about real estate development or social policy. It was about creating a place where children like Emma could grow up with security and hope. After Emma and Mrs. Patterson left, Miranda sat alone with her documents and her growing determination. She pulled out her grandmother's journal and found the passage she'd been thinking about all week. "Charles believes that business is about maximizing profit within legal boundaries. But I believe business is about maximizing human potential within moral boundaries. The two approaches lead to very different decisions." Miranda Ellison had written those words in 1985, but they could have been written yesterday. The choice between profit and human potential was exactly what Miranda faced now. Her phone rang. For a moment, hope flared that it might be Daniel, but the caller ID showed her father's office number. "Miranda, it's Jennifer. Mr. Ellison asked me to confirm your attendance at Monday's board meeting. He also wanted me to let you know that the Morrison project has accelerated its timeline. Groundbreaking is scheduled for next week." "Next week? That's 6 months ahead of schedule." "Yes, apparently some market conditions have shifted in our favor." Miranda understood. Her father was moving quickly to lock in the profits from his orchestrated chaos before she could interfere further. Once the Morrison project broke ground, the community displacement would be irreversible. "Jennifer, I need you to schedule a press conference for Monday morning, 10 a.m. A press conference? What should I tell the media it's regarding?" Miranda looked at the evidence spread across her table, thinking about Daniel's quiet integrity, Emma's innocent hopes, and her grandmother's belief in using wealth responsibly. "Tell them it's regarding the future of ethical development in the city. And Jennifer, make sure my father knows about it." Saturday morning, Miranda drove to Daniel's neighborhood and parked outside the building where Rosa Martinez lived with her 8-year-old son. She'd gotten the address from her notes from the community meeting, along with a growing conviction that if she couldn't reach Daniel directly, she could at least reach the community they'd planned to serve. Rosa answered, her door with suspicious eyes. "Miss Ellison, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to people in the neighborhood. About what my family did, about what I'm planning to do about it." Word spread quickly through the close-knit community. By afternoon, Miranda found herself in Mrs. Rodriguez's living room with 15 residents, including several people she'd met at the church meeting. Daniel told us, Rosa said without preamble, about the protest being fake, about your father's company setting the whole thing up. I didn't know, Miranda said. I swear to you, I had no idea until this week. But, you know now, said James Williams, the carpenter who'd been laid off. So what are you going to do about it? Miranda pulled out copies of the legal documents she'd been gathering. I'm going to expose everything. Monday morning at a press conference. Every document, every payment, every lie. And then what? Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was skeptical. Rich people have press conferences all the time. Nothing changes. Then I'm going to use every penny of my inheritance to fight back. The supportive housing project was just the beginning. I want to create a fund that helps families displaced by corporate manipulation. I want to establish legal aid for people who can't fight back against companies like my father's. With or without Daniel? Rosa asked quietly. Miranda's voice caught slightly. Daniel doesn't trust me anymore. I can't blame him for that. Maybe trust isn't the right word, said Father Miguel, who'd been listening quietly from the corner. Maybe the word is partnership. Daniel doesn't need to trust your motives. He needs to trust your actions. I don't understand the difference. Motives are internal, personal. Actions are public, measurable. If you do what you say you're going to do, if you keep your promises to this community regardless of what Daniel decides, then trust becomes irrelevant. Miranda spent the rest of the afternoon listening to stories about how corporate manipulation had affected individual families. Maria Santos talked about friends who'd been priced out of apartments they'd lived in for decades. Tony Valdez described the deliberate deterioration of building services designed to force out long-term residents. The thing is, Tony said as the meeting wound down, we knew something was wrong about that protest. It felt artificial, like someone was pulling strings we couldn't see, but we didn't have any way to prove it. You do now, Miranda said, indicating the documents. All of you, this evidence belongs to the community as much as it belongs to me. As Miranda drove home through the neighborhood that would soon be transformed by her family's greed, she thought about the press conference she'd scheduled for Monday. Her father would try to control the narrative, would probably claim that she was having some kind of breakdown or rebellion against family authority. But she had something Charles Ellison didn't expect, a community of people who'd been harmed by his manipulation and their willingness to stand up and tell their stories publicly. The Morrison Project might break ground next week, but Miranda was going to make sure the entire city understood the true cost of that groundbreaking. She thought about Emma's question in the cafe, "Is that why you look sad too?" The answer was yes, but not in the way the little girl had meant. Miranda was sad because she'd discovered that her entire life had been built on the suffering of families like Emma's. But she was also determined to make sure that suffering meant something, that it led to change rather than just more of the same. Monday morning would mark the beginning of a very different kind of development project, one designed to build communities rather than destroy them. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the lobby of the Ellison building, but by 9:30, Miranda could see through her office window that the crowd outside had grown beyond anything she'd anticipated. Local news vans lined the street. Their satellite dishes pointed toward the building like technological flowers following the sun. Miranda stood at her desk, arranging the final copies of evidence she would present to the media. Bank records, email chains, text messages, police reports, a comprehensive documentation of corporate manipulation that had destroyed lives for profit. Her hands were steadier than she'd expected, her resolve crystallized by a week of sleepless nights and difficult conversations. Her office door opened without a knock, and Charles Ellison entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to controlling every situation. "Miranda, we need to talk." "We tried talking, Father. You weren't Interested in listening, Charles closed the door behind him and moved to the window, surveying the media presence below. This is foolish. You're about to destroy everything your grandmother and grandfather built. I'm about to reveal what you've turned their legacy into. You're about to make enemies of every business leader in this city. You're about to ensure that no serious developer will ever work with you again. Charles turned from the window, his voice taking on the tone he'd used when she was a child who disappointed him. You're about to throw away your inheritance, your social position, your future, for what? To impress some maintenance worker who won't even take your calls. Miranda felt the familiar pull of his certainty, the way he'd always been able to make her doubt her own moral instincts. But this time, Emma's face appeared in her mind. A little girl asking for playgrounds and libraries and jobs for mums and dads. I'm about to take responsibility for what this family has done. What we've done is build an empire. What we've done is create jobs and generate tax revenue and provide housing for people who can afford quality accommodations. What we've done is manipulate communities, displace families, and turn human desperation into profit margins. Charles moved closer, his voice dropping to the persuasive tone that had convinced city councils and planning boards for decades. Miranda, you're young. You see the world in terms of moral absolutes, but business is about shades of grey, about making difficult decisions that benefit the greatest number of people. Whose definition of benefit? The market's definition. The economic system that has lifted more people out of poverty than any charitable program in human history. Miranda picked up her grandmother's journal from the desk. Grandmother didn't see it that way. Your grandmother was a romantic who could afford to be idealistic because other people handled the practical aspects of running a business. My grandmother left me specific instructions about how to use her money. She wanted it to serve communities, not exploit them. Charles's expression hardened. Your grandmother is dead, Miranda. This is a living company with real obligations to real people who depend on our success, like the people we've displaced, like the families who can't afford housing because we've driven up property values through artificial scarcity, like the construction workers who build our projects, like the architects and engineers and contractors who design them, like the service workers who maintain them, like the thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on the continued profitability of Ellison Corporation. For a moment, Miranda felt the weight of his argument. The ripple effects of business decisions were complex, and her father wasn't entirely wrong about the broader economic implications. But then she thought about Daniel losing his job for doing the right thing, about families being evicted so luxury apartments could rise in their place, about her father's casual reference to adequate desperation periods in his planning documents. Those same workers could build supportive housing instead of luxury developments. Those same architects could design communities instead of investment properties. The skills are the same, only the priorities are different. Charles checked his watch. You have 20 minutes before you step in front of those cameras and destroy your life. I'm offering you one last chance to reconsider. What exactly are you offering? Complete control of the Morrison project, $60 million to develop however you see fit. Full autonomy over all future Ellison Corporation community initiatives. It was a substantial offer, more money and authority than Miranda had ever imagined having. She could build multiple supportive housing projects with that budget, could help hundreds of families. In exchange for your silence about these alleged irregularities in our business practices, your public statement that the Ellison Corporation is committed to ethical development going forward. Miranda looked at the documents spread across her desk, evidence of years of systematic manipulation. And the families who were harmed by the alleged irregularities will benefit from our new commitment to community-focused development, without any acknowledgement of past wrongs, without any accountability for what's already been done, without destroying the company's ability to continue operating and employing people. Miranda felt the familiar pattern of her father's negotiations, the reasonable tone, the practical considerations, the way he could make selfishness sound like responsibility. "I need a minute to think." Charles nodded and moved toward the door. "Don't take too long. Those reporters aren't going to wait forever." After he left, Miranda stood alone in her office, surrounded by 31 years of inherited privilege and 1 week of moral clarity. Through her window, she could see the crowd of reporters, community members, and curious bystanders gathering in the building's lobby. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw the news vans. Whatever you're planning, I hope you know what you're doing. Daniel." Miranda stared at the message, her first communication from him since Tuesday's devastating phone call. He wasn't offering support or forgiveness, but he wasn't telling her to stop either. She typed back, "I know what I have to do. I hope someday you'll understand why." The response came quickly. "I'm watching." Miranda gathered the documents from her desk, checking one final time to ensure she had everything she needed. Bank records that proved payments to fake protesters, email chains showing coordination with city officials, text messages revealing her father's casual manipulation of human desperation. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note she'd found in her grandmother's journal, dated just months before Eleanor's death. "The true measure of wealth is not what you accumulate, but what you're willing to sacrifice for principle." Miranda took the elevator down to the lobby, where Jennifer was waiting with a wireless microphone and a podium that had been set up in front of the building's marble wall. The Ellison Corporation logo loomed behind the speaking area, its elegant script suddenly looking more like a target than a symbol of success. The crowd was larger than she'd expected, not just reporters, but community members from the Riverside district, including several faces she recognized from the church meeting. Rosa Martinez stood near the back with her son. Mrs. Rodriguez was in the front row with a determined expression, and Father Miguel was speaking quietly with a reporter from the Spanish-language newspaper. "Ms. Ellison," Jennifer touched her arm gently. "Are you ready?" Miranda looked at the faces in the crowd, thinking about Emma's question in the cafe, about Daniel's sacrifice during the protest, about her grandmother's belief that privilege came with obligations. "Yes," she said, stepping up to the podium. "I'm ready." The camera started rolling as Miranda opened the folder of evidence that would change everything. "Good morning," Miranda began, her voice carrying clearly through the lobby's marble acoustics. "My name is Miranda Ellison, and I'm here to tell you about how my family's corporation has systematically manipulated communities for profit and what I intend to do about it." The crowd quieted immediately, cameras focusing with laser precision as reporters recognized that this wasn't going to be a typical corporate press conference. Miranda lifted the first document from her stack. 3 weeks ago, a violent protest erupted outside the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. The media reported it as a grassroots community response to gentrification. What actually happened was corporate theater, funded and orchestrated by Ellison Corporation to manipulate property values in our favor. She held up bank records, the numbers clearly visible to the cameras. "These are payments made to individuals who posed as community organizers, people hired to incite the crowd and ensure that the demonstration turned violent. The goal was to create chaos that would drive down property values, allowing us to acquire additional land for the Morrison project at below-market prices." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several reporters were already texting furiously, sending real-time updates to their newsrooms. During this artificially created chaos, a hotel maintenance worker named Daniel Vega risked his job and his safety to protect someone he thought was an innocent bystander caught in the violence. That someone was me. Mr. Vega lost his job for abandoning his post to help a stranger. What he didn't know was that his termination was also part of our corporate strategy. Miranda lifted another document, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. This internal memo shows that Ellison Corporation planned to hire Mr. Vega, after what they called an adequate desperation period. The idea was to destroy his life and then offer him employment, ensuring his loyalty through manufactured gratitude. Rosa Martinez stepped forward from the back of the crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the lobby. Daniel Vega is a good man who was trying to support his daughter. Your family tried to destroy him for doing the right thing. Miranda nodded, acknowledging Rosa directly. Yes, we did. And he's not the only one. These documents show a pattern of manipulation that has displaced hundreds of families and destroyed dozens of small businesses, all in service of projects that create luxury housing for wealthy investors rather than homes for working families. Charles Ellison appeared at the back of the crowd, his face a mask of controlled fury. Miranda saw him signal to building security, but the guards hesitated, uncertain whether they had authority to stop a press conference being held by an Ellison. My father will tell you that this is business, that these are market forces, that profit maximization serves the greater good, Miranda continued. But I want you to meet some of the people whose lives have been affected by our definition of progress. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her weathered hands gripping a folder of her own. My family has lived in the Riverside district for 37 years. We raised 4 children there, built a small business there. Last month, our building was sold to developers who immediately tripled our rent. We have 60 days to find somewhere else to live. Somewhere we can afford on Social Security. Tony Valdez joined her at the front of the crowd. I was evicted from my apartment when the building was renovated for luxury tenants. The renovation consisted of cosmetic changes that justified a 300% rent increase. I've been staying in shelters for 2 months while looking for work and affordable housing. James Williams, the laid-off carpenter, spoke next. I worked construction for 15 years before the industry consolidated around luxury projects that require specialized skills I don't have. There's plenty of demand for affordable housing construction, but developers make more money building luxury units that stay empty most of the year. Miranda watched her father's expression grow darker with each testimony, but she also saw something else in the crowd: hope. People who had felt powerless against corporate manipulation were finally being heard, their stories finally being documented by media that mattered. Today, I'm announcing the establishment of the Miranda Ellison Community Justice Fund, Miranda said, pulling out a legal document she'd finalized that morning. This fund will use my entire inheritance, approximately $47 million, to provide legal aid for families displaced by corporate manipulation, to fund affordable housing projects designed by and for the communities they serve, and to support small businesses threatened by gentrification. The crowd erupted in surprised conversation. $47 million was more money than most of them could imagine, certainly more than they'd ever seen committed to community justice. Furthermore, Miranda continued, raising her voice, over the buzz of conversation, I'm resigning from Ellison Corporation and transferring my share ownership to a community land trust that will be governed by residents of neighborhoods affected by our development projects. Charles Ellison pushed through the crowd toward the podium, his corporate composure finally cracking. Miranda, you don't know what you're doing. You're destroying a company that employs thousands of people. Miranda looked at her father with something approaching pity. I'm transforming a company that exploits thousands of people into a resource that serves them instead. You're naive. You're idealistic. You have no idea how to run a business or manage that kind of money. You're right, Miranda admitted. I don't know how to run a business ethically. I was never taught that, but I'm going to learn, and I'm going to learn from people who understand what communities actually need. A reporter from the front row called out, Ms. Ellison, what's your response to critics who might say this is just a publicity stunt? Miranda thought about Daniel's text message, about Emma's questions, about her grandmother's journal entries written decades before Miranda was born. My response is that you should judge me by my actions, not my words. The legal documents establishing the fund have already been filed. The resignations are effective immediately. The money has already been transferred to community control. She held up a simple silver key, the kind used for affordable apartments rather than luxury penthouses. This is the key to the first apartment in our pilot supportive housing project. It will be ready for occupancy in 6 months, and it will be home to a family that needs stability and hope rather than charity and pity. As Miranda stepped down from the podium, Charles Ellison made one final attempt to control the narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, my daughter is going through a difficult period. These accusations are based on misunderstandings of complex business practices that Rosa Martinez interrupted him, her voice cutting through his practiced spin. Mr. Ellison, your daughter is the first person in your family to tell the truth about what you've done to our community. That's not a difficult period. That's moral courage. The crowd began to disperse, reporters filing stories that would lead the evening news, community members making plans for follow-up meetings. Miranda found herself surrounded by people whose lives had been affected by her family's business practices, but instead of anger, she saw something she hadn't expected: forgiveness. You didn't have to do this, Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly. You could have stayed quiet and kept your money and your comfortable life. My comfortable life was built on your suffering, Miranda replied. That's not sustainable for any of us. As the lobby emptied, Miranda stood alone with the weight of her decision and the lightness of her conscience. She'd given up wealth, security, and family approval, but she'd gained something more valuable: the ability to look at herself in the mirror without shame. Her phone buzzed with another text from Daniel. I saw the press conference. Emma wants to know if you still need help building those houses for families. Miranda smiled, typing back, Tell Emma I need all the help I can get. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the courtyard of the Riverside Community Housing Project, watching Emma and Rosa's son Miguel chase butterflies between the raised garden beds that residents had planted in the spring. The old textile factory had been transformed into something that looked more like a village than an apartment building. 48 units surrounding a central courtyard where children played while parents chatted on benches made from reclaimed wood. The morning sun caught the building's restored brick facade, highlighting the original architectural details that Daniel had insisted on preserving. The windows were new, but designed to match the 1924 originals, and each apartment had enough natural light to make the modest spaces feel generous rather than cramped. Miranda emerged from the community center on the ground floor, her hair tied, back with a bandana, and her jeans dusty from the morning's maintenance work. She looked nothing like the polished executive she'd been 6 months ago, but she looked more real, more grounded in a way that expensive clothes could never achieve. The childcare center passed its final inspection, she said, joining Daniel. At the garden's edge, Rosa and Mrs. Rodriguez start their certification program next week. Daniel nodded, watching Emma help Miguel plant marigolds along the garden's border. James finished installing the workshop equipment yesterday. First class starts Monday, basic home repair skills for residents. It had taken 6 months of planning, construction, and bureaucratic navigation to reach this point. But the Riverside project had become everything they'd envisioned during those early conversations in the cafe. More than that, it had become a model that other cities were already studying and adapting. The press conference had triggered investigations into Ellison Corporation's business practices, resulting in fines, legal settlements, and a court-mandated restructuring that put community representatives on the company's board of directors. Charles Ellison had resigned rather than work under community oversight, taking a position with a development firm in another state. But the more significant change had been cultural. Miranda's public break with her family's practices had inspired other wealthy individuals to examine their own complicity in systems that generated profit through human suffering. The Eleanor Ellison Community Justice Fund had grown beyond Miranda's initial contribution, attracting donations from philanthropists who wanted to support community-controlled development. Emma's been asking about the wedding again, Daniel said, gesturing toward his daughter, who was now showing Miguel how to measure spacing between plants. Miranda smiled, unconsciously touching the simple gold band on her left ring finger. They'd been married 3 weeks ago in the courtyard where they now stood, surrounded by residents, community leaders, and the small chosen family they'd built together. Father Miguel had performed the ceremony, Emma had been the flower girl, and Mrs. Patterson had cried happy tears from the front row of folding chairs. "She wants to know when you two are going to give her a baby brother or sister," Daniel continued, his tone teasing, but his eyes serious. "Soon," Miranda said, her hand moving to her still flat belly. "Sooner than she knows." Daniel's face lit up with surprise and joy. "Really? Really?" Dr. Santos confirmed it yesterday. Daniel pulled her into his arms, spinning her around in a circle that made Emma look up from her gardening with delighted laughter. When he set Miranda down, she was grinning with the kind of happiness that came from building something meaningful, rather than inheriting something hollow. "Does this mean I get to help design the nursery?" Emma called out, having abandoned her flowers in favor of more interesting adult conversation. "It means you get to help with everything," Miranda said, kneeling to Emma's level. "You're going to be the best big sister in the world." Emma threw her arms around Miranda's neck with the fierce affection of a child who'd learned that family could be created as well as inherited. "Will the baby live here with all of us?" "Right here," Daniel confirmed, "in the apartment with the big windows that faces the garden." The apartment Daniel referred to was on the 2nd floor, with windows that overlooked both the courtyard and the street beyond. It was modest by Ellison family standards, but luxurious by Daniel's previous experience. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen large enough for family meals, and a living room where Emma could spread out her homework while Daniel and Miranda planned the next phase of their community development work. Miranda had initially struggled with the transition from penthouse to project apartment, not because of the physical differences, but because of what those differences represented. Giving up her inherited wealth had been a moral choice, but learning to live on earned income had been a practical education in budgeting, prioritizing, and understanding the daily stress that most families navigated without thinking about it. But she'd also discovered something unexpected: contentment that came from useful work rather than inherited privilege. Her days were filled with construction oversight, community meetings, grant applications, and the 100 small decisions that turned abstract plans into livable spaces. It was exhausting and often frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying, in a way that board meetings and investment reviews had never been. "Daddy, Miss Miranda, look." Emma pointed toward the building's entrance, where a moving truck was unloading furniture for the Williams family. Who would be the project's newest residents? James Williams directed the movers with the confidence of someone who understood both construction and the importance of making a space feel like home. His wife, Sarah, carried boxes, while their teenage daughter helped neighbors who'd come out to assist with the move-in process. It was a scene that repeated itself every few weeks as new families joined the community. Each move-in was celebrated. Each new resident welcomed not as a tenant, but as a neighbor whose success contributed to everyone's well-being. "The next project site survey is Thursday," Miranda mentioned, as they watched the Williams family settle into their new life. "The Eastside Property Collective thinks they can have financing in place by fall. The Eastside project would be larger, 60 units plus commercial space for resident-owned businesses. More ambitious than Riverside, but based on the same principles of community control and dignified design. I'll have the building assessment ready by then," Daniel said. "The structure is solid, but the mechanical systems need complete replacement." They talked easily about deadlines and budgets, their partnership now seasoned by months of shared problem-solving and mutual respect. What had begun as an unlikely alliance between a maintenance worker and an heiress had evolved into something neither of them had expected: a marriage built on shared values rather than shared backgrounds. Emma tugged on Miranda's hand, drawing her attention back to the garden. "Can we plant tomatoes next year?" Mrs. Rodriguez says tomatoes taste better when you grow them yourself. We can plant whatever the community votes to grow, Miranda said. This is everyone's garden, so everyone gets to help decide. Even kids, especially kids. You're the ones who will live here the longest, so your voices matter the most. As the afternoon sun slanted through the courtyard, families emerged from their apartments to enjoy the cooling air and each other's company. Children played games that spanned multiple languages and generations. Adults shared stories and advice while keeping collective watch over the younger residents. Daniel found himself thinking about the evening 3 weeks ago when he'd stood in this same courtyard, waiting for Miranda to walk down the makeshift aisle between the garden beds. She'd worn a simple white dress and carried wildflowers picked by Emma and the other children. Her vows had been about building something together rather than promising to love despite their differences. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes," she'd said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtyard, "but I promise that when I do, I'll listen to this community and learn from the people who trust us with their homes and their futures." It wasn't the kind of romantic declaration that movies were made of, but it was exactly the kind of practical commitment that successful partnerships required. Now, watching their community come to life around them, Daniel understood that they'd built something larger than a housing project. They'd created proof that a different kind of development was possible, one that strengthened communities rather than displacing them. Emma ran over to them, her hands dirty from planting, and her face bright with the kind of joy that came from useful work. "Daddy, do you think Mama would be proud of our new house?" Daniel's throat tightened with the question. Maria had been gone for 4 years now, but Emma still referenced her mother's opinions on important matters. It was a habit that had initially worried Daniel, but now seemed like a healthy way to keep her mother's memory alive. "I think Mama would love everything about this place," Daniel said, kneeling to Emma's level. "I think she'd love that we're part of a community where people take care of each other. And she'd love Miranda too." Daniel glanced at his wife, who was listening to their conversation with the careful attention she gave to all matters involving Emma's emotional well-being. "She'd love that Miranda makes you laugh and helps with your homework and builds houses for families who need them." Emma nodded seriously, then brightened with 8-year-old resilience. "I think the baby is going to love it here too. There are lots of kids to play with and gardens to explore, and grown-ups who aren't too busy to pay attention." As evening approached and families began moving indoors for dinner, Daniel and Miranda walked to their apartment with Emma between them, each holding one of her hands. The simple silver key that had once symbolized hope for the future now opened the door to their actual home. Inside, Emma headed directly to her room to work on a school project about community helpers. She'd chosen to write about her father and stepmother, while Daniel and Miranda sat at their kitchen table to review plans for the next day's work. But first, Miranda pulled out her grandmother's journal, now worn from frequent reading and marked with notes in the margins. She turned to a passage near the end, written in Miranda Ellison's careful handwriting just months before her death. "The measure of a life well lived isn't the wealth accumulated or the power achieved, but the communities strengthened and the hope created for those who come after us." Daniel reached across the table and took Miranda's hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Through their kitchen window, they could see the courtyard where children would grow up with security and possibility, where families would build the kind of support networks that helped people survive and thrive. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined 6 months ago, but it was exactly the life they'd chosen to build together. One decision, one conversation, one act of courage at a time. Sometimes the most ordinary moment could indeed change everything. And sometimes, when you were very lucky and very brave, change led to something better than you'd ever dared to hope for.